Well, it's time to go back in time. We're going to do another one of what I call my Magical History Tour series, where I'll pick one year and look at all the classic rock, or most of the classic rock, that came out during that year. I've already done episodes on 64, 65, 66, 67, 68. So in this episode, we're going to turn to that monumental year in music of 1969. So get ready to roll up, because here comes that Magical History Tour bus, and we're going to set the Wayback Machine to 1969. And the way we do that is we drop the needle. Now, 1969 was both a terrific and a tragic year for music, and there was an awful lot of music that came out. So what I'm going to do is we'll talk about these albums, but I'm just going to pick my favorite two songs from each of them, and I'll bet you'll disagree. As the year starts and the cold breezes of winter grip San Francisco, first album to come out on the 5th of January doesn't sound like it's from San Francisco at all. It sounds like it's from a swamp. And it is the second album by Creedence Clearwater Revival, called Bayou Country. And yeah, I talked about that in detail on an episode on Creedence Clearwater as well. It's a good album, and for my two choices, I'm going with Born on the Bayou and Proud Mary. Now, from the bayous of San Francisco, let's hop on a plane and go over to London, because on the 12th of January, a debut album comes out from a band, and the album is tremendous. And this is the start of an incredible career for the band Led Zeppelin, and that's the name of the album as well. Now, in a previous episode about hitchhiking, I talk about how I hitchhiked 300 miles to see Led Zeppelin when they appeared in Chicago to support this first album. And that's because the album so blew me away. How am I going to pick just two songs from this great album? But I'm going to go with Good Times, Bad Times, and Dazed and Confused. Staying in London, on the very next day, January 13th, the Beatles release a soundtrack album called Yellow Submarine. Now, it's an interesting album. Side 1 has got Beatles songs on it that are in the movie, and then side 2 has orchestral songs that George Martin wrote and recorded for the movie. So I'm just going to look at side 1. So for my two songs, I'm going to pick the great rocker, Hey Bulldog, and you can really tell how John and Paul are having a great time singing this one. And in fact, at the end of the song, they start barking like dogs. And for my number 2 pick, it's got to be that hippie, trippy, psychedelic feedback extravaganza from George. It's all too much. And then two monumental things happen just 10 days apart near the end of January. The first is on January 20th, Richard Nixon is inaugurated as president. Now, a lot of us were disappointed in that, but we really had no idea how bad it was going to get. On a somewhat happier note, 10 days later in London, and it's a very cold day in London, John, Paul, George, and Ringo appear on the rooftop for their last concert together as the Beatles. Now we roll into February, and we find ourselves in Detroit. And there's a group called Motor City 5, or more commonly MC5, and their first album, which is a live album, is called Kick Out the Jams. And in the title song, they actually sing Kick Out the Jams, motherfucker. Well, of course, the label didn't like that. So in subsequent releases, they re-sang it as Kick Out the Jams, Brothers and Sisters. Now, I can't say that I was ever really a fan of MC5, but if I got to pick off two from this album, I'm going to pick Kick Out the Jams and the song that they wrote with Sun Ra, which is that weird song, Starship. So back in London, at the end of 1968, a supergroup decides that they've had enough. So their final album comes out in 1969. And the album is their farewell album. It's called Goodbye Cream. Now, there's only 6 tracks on this album. 3 are live and 3 are studio tracks. So I'm going to go for 2 that are from the studio. And the first is Doing That Scrapyard Thing. And then, of course, there is the wonderful Eric Clapton, George Harrison collaboration badge. For our next two records, we go back to California, but this time Southern California. Yeah, sunny Southern California. And the Byrds have sort of disbanded and changed around, and Graham Parsons and Chris Hillman have left, and so they have decided to form a new band called the Flying Burrito Brothers. And their first album is called Gilded Palace of Sin. And for my two picks, I'm going with Sin City and Dark End of the Street. On February 10th in 1969, the Beach Boys release an album, and this was a very hard time for the group. Brian Wilson had checked himself into a psychiatric hospital, and Carl Wilson and Dennis Wilson were recording music with an aspiring musician. These recordings have never been released because the name of that aspiring musician was Charles Manson. Anyway, the album is 2020, and it's largely outtakes from previous recordings. So if I'm going to pick two, I'm going to go with Do It Again and I Can Hear Music. Our last album to come out in February is actually one of the first albums to come out on the Beatles record label Apple. And it was produced by Paul McCartney, and it's Mary Hopkins' Postcard. Besides Paul producing it and playing on the record, he gets George Martin to score some stuff and play on the record as well, and his good friend Donovan to also appear. And so for my two picks, I'm going with the hit, Those Were the Days, and Donovan's Lord of the Reedy River. Well, now we get to March, and we get to make the decision whether it comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb, or vice versa. But our first album doesn't have any lions on it. It has a group on it that you could hardly recognize, even though it is their seventh studio album. It's by the Byrds, and the album is Dr. Byrds and Mr. Hyde. But Roger McGuinn is the only member of the original Byrds that's still there. He's joined by Clarence White on guitar, Gene Parsons on drums, and John York on bass. Now this is a pretty mediocre album. This is the lowest selling Byrds album ever released. For the two that I'm going to pick, their cover of Bob Dylan's This Wheels on Fire and Drugstore Truck Driving Man. Also in Los Angeles, Linda Ronstadt leaves the Stone Ponies and decides to pursue a solo career, and she records her first album, Home Sewn, Homegrown, and it is not a commercial success. But of course she went on to become a huge international star, and hey, everybody's got to start somewhere. And for my two, I'm going to go with Silver Threads and Golden Needles and her version of Bob Dylan's I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. Another album to come out in March is by Steppenwolf, and it's called Monster. And yeah, I've done an episode on Steppenwolf where I talk about this album and their career in more detail. For my two, I'll pick Monster, Suicide America, and Move Over. Our next band comes from Cleveland, Ohio, and they're called the James Gang. And their lead singer, main songwriter, and lead guitarist is a pretty wild individual called Joe Walsh, who after the James Gang broke up, had great success as a solo artist, and then of course joined the Eagles. For my two picks from this album, Funk Number 48 and their cover of the Buffalo Springfield's Bluebird. Meanwhile, out in San Francisco, Quicksilver Messenger Service releases their second album, and yeah, I've done an episode on them as well where I talk about this album in quite a bit of detail. The album is Happy Trails. For my two, yeah, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to pick Who Do You Love, which takes all of side one, and then I'm going to take the closer, the crazy Happy Trails. Next up is a sprawling double album, and it comes from a group out of London who are actually Australian, and it is the Bee Gees. The album is called Odessa, and originally the idea was to do a concept album about a doomed ship. They made this double album. It was not a success. The concept didn't hold up all the way through, and I think people got a little bit confused by it. There's an awful lot of music on this record. So for my two, I'll go with the lead-off track, Odessa, City on the Black Sea, and one of the last songs on side 4, The First of May. And now, we're at the end of March, so again, does it go out like a lion or go out like a lamb? Well, that's pretty much up for you to decide, because at the end of March, John Lennon and Yoko Ono decide they're going to do a bed-in for peace. And they invite the world's press into their hotel bedroom. Now, I imagine that the press thought, oh, wow, we're going to get interviews and photos and footage of John and Yoko making love, or I don't know. Well, what they got was John and Yoko in their pajamas, sitting in the bed, espousing peace. And then, of course, we got a pretty good song out of that whole experience, too, because they did record Give Peace a Chance on their bed in a hotel room. Now, that's just the first 3 months of 1969, and we've looked at 14 albums. A lot of music there. And if you want to recap, as usual, I've got a playlist on Spotify for this episode where you can listen to a lot of this music. But now we're going to move into the springtime of 1969. And of course, there's going to be a lot more music to look at. But for now, our Magical History Tour bus is grinding to a stop, and it's time for you to jump off the bus. Watch your step, or as they say in the UK, mind the gap. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'. If you like this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.